In 1206, a warlord named Temujin united the Mongol tribes and took the name Genghis Khan. Within 70 years, his descendants ruled the largest land empire in history. Most people think they conquered with arrows and horses. The truth is, they conquered with food. Number 14 on this list, let a soldier ride for days without ever stopping to cook. Number 3 was so disturbing to European visitors that some refused to write down what they saw. And number 1 fueled an entire civilization, yet most Americans have never tasted it. These 20 dishes built an empire stretching from Korea to Hungary. Hit that subscribe button and let us count down the 20 shocking dishes that fed Genghis Khan's empire. Number 20. Millet gruel. Before you picture endless platters of roasted meat, understand that the everyday Mongol meal was often a thin porridge. Soldiers carried small sacks of millet, the one grain that traveled well across the dry steppe, and boiled it into a gruel they called bantan. A handful of grain went into a pot of water, sometimes with a scrap of dried meat or a splash of milk stirred in. It cooked in minutes over a fire of dried dung, because there were no trees out on the grass. It was bland, it was gray, and it sat heavy in the stomach in exactly the way a hungry man needs. The genius was portability. A pound of millet weighed almost nothing and lasted for months. While European armies starved waiting for supply wagons, a Mongol rider carried tomorrow's dinner in a pouch on his belt. Plain food, but it kept an empire moving. Number 19. Wild steppe onions and garlic. The Mongols had almost no spice rack. What they had was the ground beneath their horses. Across the grasslands grew wild allium, small pungent onions and garlic that herders dug up by the handful and tossed into the cooking pot. This was not just for flavor, though it was the only flavor most meals ever got. Those wild greens carried vitamin C, the nutrient that prevents scurvy, the disease that destroyed navies and armies fed on nothing but meat. The Mongols never knew the chemistry. They simply knew that men who ate the steppe onions stayed strong on long campaigns, and men who did not got sick. Travelers reported soldiers chewing wild garlic raw in the saddle. It was free, it grew everywhere, and it quietly solved a nutritional problem that would not be understood by science for another 600 years. Number 18. Tarag. Long before yogurt became a health food aisle, the Mongols were making it by the bucket. Tarag was soured milk, fermented in a leather bag or a wooden pail using a starter culture saved from the last batch. A herder would warm fresh milk, stir in a spoonful of the previous day's tarag, and let the wild bacteria do the rest in the warmth of the gear. By evening, it had thickened into something tangy, cool, and alive. The fermentation did two things at once. It preserved milk that would otherwise spoil within hours in the summer heat, and it pre-digested the lactose, which mattered because many adults struggle with fresh milk. Today, we pay a premium for probiotic yogurt and brag about gut health. Mongol children grew up on the living cultures in Tarag without anyone ever printing the word probiotic on a label. Number 17. Byaslag. When a family had more milk than they could drink, they turned it into cheese. Byaslag was a simple fresh curd made by heating milk and adding something sour, often a bit of the day's tarag or a splash of fermented whey, until it separated into curds and liquid. The curds were pressed between two flat boards weighted with a stone, squeezing out the moisture until you had a firm white round that could be sliced. Pressed hard and dried, it would keep through the winter. A herder could hang a slab of byaslag from the roof of the gur and shave pieces off for months. It was mild, slightly rubbery, faintly sour. Nothing fancy. But for a people who could not grow crops and could not store much, turning a perishable liquid into a solid block that lasted half a year was a small act of survival genius repeated in every household on the steppe. Number 16. Orurom. This was the closest thing the steppe had to a luxury. Orurom was clotted cream, skimmed from the top of milk that had been slowly simmered and then left to cool overnight. A thick golden skin formed across the surface, rich with butterfat, and the women of the household lifted it off in delicate sheets. Spread over bread or eaten with a drizzle of wild honey when honey could be found, it was the treat reserved for guests, elders, and celebrations. The leftover liquid was never wasted. It became the base for other dairy products down the line. Orurom tells you something important about Mongol cooking. These were not careless eaters tearing into raw flesh, the way the propaganda of their enemies painted them. They were patient dairy artisans who understood milk better than almost any culture on Earth, coaxing cream, cheese, yogurt, and butter from the same animals that also carried them into battle. Number 15. Aaruul. If you had to pick one snack that crossed the entire empire, it was Aaruul, dried curds. After making cheese and skimming cream, the leftover curds were pressed into shapes, sometimes squares, sometimes little twists, and laid out on the roof of the ger to bake under the relentless steppe sun. Within days, they hardened into chunks tough enough to crack a tooth. And that was the point. Aaruul lasted for years without spoiling, weighed almost nothing, and a rider could keep a pocket of it for an entire campaign. You did not bite it, you sucked on it, letting it slowly soften in your mouth like a stone of concentrated milk. It delivered protein, fat, and calcium in the most compact form imaginable. Mongols believed it kept their teeth strong, and modern dentists, looking at the abrasive sugar-free curd, would not entirely disagree. It was the original survival jerky, except made of milk. Number 14. Borts. Here is the secret weapon that conquered the world. Borts was meat reduced to powder. A herder would take lean beef or horse meat, cut it into thin strips, and hang it inside the ger through the cold, dry winter where it dehydrated completely without ever rotting. Then he pounded that brittle dried meat into a fine dust. And here is the part that sounds impossible. An entire cow could be reduced to borts and stored inside the animal's own cleaned bladder, a parcel small enough to lash behind a saddle. On campaign, a soldier dropped a handful into his upturned helmet, added water and maybe a scrape of millet, and let it swell back into a hearty soup as he rode. No fire required, no stopping, no supply train trailing behind for miles. While enemy generals planned around slow wagons of grain, Mongol cavalry carried a side of beef as a pouch of powder. It was freeze-dried rations 700 years before the words existed. Number 13. Camel and yak milk. The Mongols did not rely on one animal, they milked 5, and the strangest of them fed the harshest corners of the empire. In the dry south and the edges of the Gobi, herders milked Bactrian camels, the two-humped giants built for desert crossings. Camel milk is richer in fat and minerals than cow's milk and stays drinkable in heat that would curdle everything else. In the cold mountains to the north, families milked yaks, the shaggy, high-altitude oxen that thrive where ordinary cattle freeze. Yak milk is so thick it is almost cream straight from the udder. Both were fermented, churned into butter, and dried into curds exactly like the milk of horses and cows. This is the quiet logistics lesson of the empire. Wherever the Mongols went, from scorching desert to icy peak, some animal in their herd could survive there and feed them. Their pantry walked alongside the army. Number 12. Korkhog. When it was time to actually feast on meat, the Mongols cooked with stones. Korkhog was a stew made by heating fist-sized rocks in a fire until they glowed, then layering them with chunks of mutton and a little water inside a sealed metal container or a tight pot. The lid went on, and the trapped heat from the stones cooked the meat from the inside out, steaming and searing it at the same time. After an hour, you opened the pot to fall-apart mutton in a rich broth, and the herders would pass around the hot, greasy stones to hold, believing they drew sickness out of the hands. It was a pressure cooker improvised from a campfire and the rocks underfoot. Modern chefs rediscovering this technique act as if hot stone cooking is some clever new idea. Mongol families were doing it in the 13th century with nothing but a fire, a pot, and the ground beneath their feet. Number 11. Bodog. This one stops people cold. Bodog was an animal cooked from the inside. A goat, or, most shockingly, a tarbagan marmot, a fat steppe rodent, was carefully gutted through the neck or belly so the skin and body stayed mostly intact, forming a natural bag. Then red-hot stones were dropped inside along with the meat, and the whole thing was sealed and roasted, often with a blowtorch of burning brush singeing the outside while the stones cooked it within. The skin acted as a pressure vessel, the fat basting the meat as it steamed. The result was tender, smoky, and intensely rich. Here is the dark footnote. The marmot used for Bodog is a known carrier of the plague bacterium, and historians have linked steppe marmot hunting to outbreaks of the very disease that would later devastate medieval Europe. The Mongols ate the animal that helped carry the Black Death and never knew it. Here is where the picture gets bigger. Stop and think about what these 11 foods have in common. Borts, Aaruul, dried cheese, fermented milk, a porridge that cooks in a helmet. Every single one was built around a single problem that no other army on Earth had solved. Movement. A Mongol force could ride 100 miles in a day and keep doing it for weeks because it carried no kitchen, no bakery, no slow ox cart full of flour. The food was the animal they rode beside, the powder behind the saddle, the dried curd in the pocket. There was no supply line to cut, no granary to burn, no road they had to follow. While their enemies tied themselves to towns and harvests, the Mongols ate the steppe itself and went wherever the grass led. Genghis Khan did not win because his men were stronger. He won because his men never had to stop and wait for dinner. Number 10. The fat-tailed sheep. If the herd had a king, it was the sheep, and the prize of the sheep was its enormous fatty tail. Mongol breeds stored fat in a thick paddle at the rear, and that fat was treasure, rendered for cooking, eaten in slabs, prized above the lean meat itself in a world where calories meant survival through a brutal winter. A whole sheep was boiled simply in water with nothing but salt, and the cuts were distributed by rank, the choicest fatty pieces going to the most honored at the gathering. There was no roasting rack, no marinade, no sauce. The fat was the flavor and the fuel. To a modern American raised to trim every visible bit of fat off the plate, this looks backward. But for men burning thousands of calories a day in the saddle through sub-zero cold, that wobbling tail of pure fat was the single most valuable thing a sheep could offer. Number 9. The boiled sheep's head. Nothing was wasted, and the head was an honor, not an afterthought. When a sheep was slaughtered for an important guest, the whole head was boiled and presented to the most respected person at the meal, often the eldest man or a visiting dignitary. He was expected to slice pieces from the cheeks, the tongue, even the eyes, and share them around the circle as a gesture of generosity. To receive the head was to be told, without words, that you mattered. The cheek meat was tender and rich, the tongue prized for its texture, and every soft part was eaten down to the bone. Refusing it would have been a grave insult to the host. This was the steppe code of hospitality made edible. In a culture with no written menus and few luxuries, who got which part of the animal said everything about who you were and how welcome you had been made. Number 8. Blood sausage. The Mongol principle was absolute. When an animal died, every drop of it was used, and that included the blood. At slaughter, the blood was caught in a basin before it could touch the ground, then mixed with chopped fat, wild onion, and a little grain or flour, and stuffed into the cleaned intestines to make a thick, dark sausage. It was boiled in the same pot as the rest of the meat and sliced into rich, mineral-heavy rounds. To squeamish outsiders, this was the height of barbarism. To the Mongols, it was simple arithmetic. Blood is dense with iron and protein, and a people living one hard winter away from starvation could not afford to throw away a single nutrient. Cultures all over the world quietly do the same thing, from British black pudding to Spanish morcilla. The Mongols just did it on the open steppe, with the animal that had carried them, leaving nothing behind but bones. Number 7. Eezgii. Out of the cheese-making process came one more preserved food, Eezgii, a roasted dried curd. After separating curds from milk, the curds were cooked down in their own way over a slow fire, stirred for hours until the moisture evaporated and the sugars caramelized into golden brown, crumbly nuggets. Then they were dried in the sun until rock solid, like Aaruul but darker and toastier, almost nutty from the long cooking. Eezgii kept for an extraordinarily long time and made a high-energy snack for travel, sweet enough to feel like a small reward at the end of a hard day. It is a perfect example of the Mongol mindset toward dairy. They did not just preserve milk one way, they had a dozen overlapping products, each made from a different stage of the same process, each lasting a different length of time. A single bucket of milk could become drink, cream, butter, fresh cheese, dried curd, and roasted curd. Nothing evaporated that could not be saved. Number 6. Arkhi. Yes, the Mongols had liquor, and they made it from milk. Arkhi, sometimes called Shimian Arkhi or milk vodka, was distilled from fermented mare's or cow's milk using a simple still set over the fire. The fermented milk was heated, the alcohol vapor rose, and it was condensed back into a clear, mild spirit, weaker than modern vodka, but potent enough to warm a man in a frozen jur and loosen the talk at a feast. It was poured at celebrations, offered to honored guests, and flicked into the air as an offering to the sky and the spirits before drinking. The idea of distilling alcohol out of dairy strikes most people today as bizarre. But on a steppe with no grapes, no barley to spare, and no orchards, milk was the only thing abundant enough to ferment. The same animals that gave the Mongols their food, their clothing, and their transport also gave them their celebration in a cup. Here is the part modern nutrition science is only now catching up to. Look at the whole Mongol diet together, and a strange truth emerges. They split their food into two categories: white foods and red foods. White was everything from milk, the dairy that dominated the warm months. Red was meat, which carried them through winter. On paper, this looks like a recipe for disease. Almost no vegetables, no fruit, no grain to speak of. And yet these people conquered the known world in the saddle. The fermented milk gave them vitamin C and living bacteria for digestion. The organ meats and blood gave them iron, B vitamins, and minerals that lean muscle meat alone cannot supply. The wild onions filled the last gap. Eating the whole animal and drinking the fermented milk, they accidentally built a nearly complete diet out of the only things the steppe could give. They had no laboratories. They had 13th century instinct, and it was enough. Number 5, the Great Hunt. The Mongols did not just herd, they hunted on a scale that boggles the mind, and it doubled as military training. The Nurj was a massive organized hunt where thousands of riders formed an enormous ring across the open country, sometimes miles wide, and slowly closed it inward over days, driving every animal inside toward the center. Gazelle, deer, wild boar, wild ass, foxes, marmots, all of it was funneled into a shrinking circle until the killing began under the commander's signal. It fed the army with fresh game and, more importantly, it trained men to maneuver in perfect coordination across vast distances, exactly the skill that won battles. Genghis Khan treated the hunt as warfare practice with dinner as the bonus. A single great Nurj could provision a host for weeks. It was the only kind of grocery run in history that also functioned as army drills, and the prey never had a chance. Number 4. Suutei tsai. As the empire swallowed China and opened the trade roads, a new staple flowed back to the steppe: tea. The Mongols took it and made it their own in a way that horrifies tea purists to this day. Suutei tsai was salt milk tea, brewed by boiling pressed tea with water, then adding milk and, crucially, a pinch of salt instead of sugar. Sometimes a spoonful of butter or a handful of toasted millet went in too, turning the drink into something closer to a thin soup than a beverage. In the dry cold of the steppe, this salty, fatty, warm tea did real work. It rehydrated, it replaced the salt lost to hard riding, and it delivered quick energy in a cup. Today we sell electrolyte drinks and butter coffee as cutting-edge performance fuel. The descendants of Genghis Khan were drinking salted, buttered, caloric tea as a survival tool while the empire still ruled half of Asia. Number 3. Drinking blood from a living horse. Here is the practice that some foreign observers found too disturbing to fully record. On the fastest, most desperate rides, when there was no time to stop, no time to cook, and no animal to spare, a Mongol soldier would feed himself directly from the horse beneath him. He would open a small vein in the animal's neck, drink a measured amount of the warm blood, and then close the cut so the horse could keep running. The blood gave him protein, salt, and iron, just enough to push on through another stretch of country, and the horse, if the rider was careful and rotated between mounts, survived to carry him further. Marco Polo described Mongol riders sustaining themselves this way for days. To Europeans tied to their bread and their campfires, a man drinking from his own living mount was the stuff of nightmares. To the Mongols, it was simply how you crossed a continent faster than anyone believed possible. Step back one last time and the whole story comes into focus. Every empire before the Mongols moved at the speed of its stomach. Armies marched only as far as their bread wagons could follow, fought only as long as the granaries held, and broke whenever the harvest failed. The Mongols cut that chain entirely. Their food walked beside them, dried in their pockets, fermented in their saddlebags, and ran in the veins of their horses. They could appear 1,000 miles from where anyone expected, because they were never waiting on a single thing the way other armies waited. The dried meat, the milk turned to powder and stone, the blood drunk on the move, none of it was an accident. It was the most advanced military logistics system on Earth, disguised as the everyday diet of herders. Genghis Khan's true secret weapon was never the bow. It was breakfast. Number 2, the mutton soup. For all the dried curds and powdered meat of the campaign trail, the heart of Mongol cooking was a simple bowl of mutton broth, what they called shulin. Chunks of fatty mutton on the bone were simmered slowly in water with wild onion and salt until the broth turned cloudy and rich, the marrow melting out of the bones to give it body. As the empire grew and its courts settled into palaces, this humble soup became cuisine. A court physician named Hu Si-hui compiled an entire dietary manual for the Mongol emperor in 1330, the Yinshan Zhengyao, filled with mutton soups and broths refined with imported spices and grains gathered from across the conquered world. It is one of the oldest surviving documents proving that the steppe diet did not vanish. It evolved into something written down and treasured. We pay $9 a cup now and call it a wellness discovery. The Mongols built an empire on it and then wrote the cookbook. Number 1, Airag. Above every other food stands the drink of the steppe, Airag, fermented mare's milk, known to outsiders as kumis. Mare's milk was poured into a large leather bag and stirred, sometimes thousands of times a day as people passed by, allowing wild yeasts and bacteria to ferment it into a tangy, fizzy, mildly alcoholic drink. The Franciscan friar William of Rubruck, who visited the Mongol court in the 1250s, described how it bit the tongue, finished with a taste like almond milk, and left a man pleasantly lightheaded. Airag was everything at once. It was hydration. It was nutrition packed with vitamin C and probiotics. It was a mild intoxicant for celebration, and it was sacred, flicked toward the sky as an offering before any was drunk. The finest white Airag was reserved for the Khan himself. This was the true national drink of an empire, the living, bubbling milk that fueled the men who conquered the world. Most Americans have never tasted it. The Mongols could not have lived without it. That is the empire on a plate, 20 foods that conquered more land than Rome. Here is the challenge. The next time someone tells you armies win on courage, remember that Genghis Khan won on dried milk and a pouch of powdered beef. Try one of these yourself, the bone broth, the salted milk tea, even the hot stone cooking, and tell me in the comments which one surprised you most. I want to know if the powdered meat shocks you more than the horse blood. Because these were not just meals. They were the quiet machinery of the largest empire that ever existed.